News coming to you a week after the SEC announced its plan to shift to a 10-game conference-only schedule for the 2020 college football season due to the coronavirus pandemic. Today, the SEC announces which additional cross-divisional teams each SEC team will face. Here to talk about Alabama's schedule is Mike Rodak with AL.com. Thank you so much for joining us on the fly. Breaking news. This is how it works. It's Friday. What better way to ring in the weekend than to have a little bit more insight as to which teams Alabama will be playing outside of the slate that they already had for their SEC West teams and, of course, Georgia. So go ahead and make the reveal, my friend.
Yeah, it's a little strange. A 5 o'clock on Friday announcement from the SEC, you think it would be bad news, and it wasn't bad news for Alabama, at least. I mean, they're going to draw Kentucky and Missouri as their two opponents. Kentucky at home at Bryant-Denny Stadium and Missouri on the road in Columbia. So probably the best case scenario for them, just given the potential outcomes. And a lot of people had talked about maybe just taking their 2021 cross-division opponents or 2022 as well and just kind of moving them up. That's not really what happened here. I mean, the SEC decided to change everything up and give some teams some different looks. And again, you're talking about two teams in the SEC East who have struggled as of late, and certainly a first-year coach in Missouri and Eli Drinkwitz. So it's again, it's a pretty good deal for Alabama. It's a good deal for LSU too, if you start to look at some of the other schools in the conference. And ultimately, if you're talking about a season happening, if it does happen, and a college football playoff happening, then you're talking about two games that you can kind of pencil in a W there, as opposed to maybe a Florida or even playing South Carolina again, playing another SEC East team that's a little bit higher up the totem pole, not quite as a sure bet.
Yes, of course, we know Georgia was already on the slate along with its annual rival, Tennessee. And so then you have Georgia, Tennessee, Missouri, and Kentucky all from the SEC East. Now, they're expected to announce the full schedules next week in terms of what those matchups look like when they actually will be playing those. So I think that'll be kind of interesting as well, how those will shake out. Let me just ask you, what do you think some of the criteria or maybe things that kind of went into determining this? Because all of a sudden you're literally like taking a box, throwing all the teams in it, shaking it up, and then like rolling it out. And so I'm just curious to know like some of the criteria and things that might go into this decision-making process.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to be a fly on the wall in that room, or that virtual room more than likely, where they made those decisions, and if there was any scientific mathematical formula there that they used, because at the end of the day, I'm sure Missouri's not too happy about their draw, which is Alabama and LSU, and everybody's kind of making jokes right now about them. But look, for the SEC, I mean, the SEC probably cares a little bit less about Missouri than they do about Alabama and LSU, and that's kind of been the story as the years have gone on. They've resisted having a bigger conference schedule, and they've stayed at 8 games when they could have gone to 9. And obviously you have a 10-game schedule now, and you're wanting to make sure that you can put an Alabama or an LSU or maybe an Auburn or a Georgia into the playoff and not have those teams cannibalize each other essentially. And that's really the bottom line here. I think that it was a business decision in some ways by the SEC. And that's just really what I think it boils down to, more than trying to actually pare it down to something that's perfectly fair.
Yeah, and so Patrick, our producer, popped up a beautiful, colorful graphic if he wants to pop that back up again. Would you say there's any other notable matchups? I know you mentioned obviously LSU, being one of them. Any other, I guess, notable matchups or teams that kind of stand out to you when you saw this? You're like, oh, wow, that's cool.
Well, I think Missouri for everybody. I think that was kind of the running Twitter joke and just kind of what they have to go through. But Auburn's draw as well, I think is fairly reasonable for them. Having what they're going to host Tennessee and they're going to play at South Carolina. That's not terribly difficult. In fact, that's what Alabama did last year. And so, that's pretty much what you'd expect. The bigger schools are probably going to have an easier time. Now, what those schools might say is that, like Auburn, they're playing at Georgia, of course, they do every year. Alabama plays Georgia this year. So they could say, hey, we already had a pretty strong opponent on our schedule. So it makes sense to add something that's a little bit less challenging. And that might be their argument here. But again, at the end of the day, I think, it's a pretty good outcome for both Alabama and Auburn.
Yeah, no doubt. And of course, that graphic there made by the SEC. So good stuff. And, one more question before we get into some of the COVID requirements that came down earlier today by the SEC. We've often thought coaches of the SEC would be thrilled with that SEC only or Power 5 only schedule. Thoughts on how this might play out in the minds of the coaches and decision makers? Because in essence, some of the coaches are kind of getting a little bit what they were hoping for. I mean, obviously, they didn't think it was going to go down this way with the pandemic per se. But, what does this do for the strength of the SEC with everyone playing each other?
Yeah, well, if you can have a team that gets through that gauntlet and is able to go undefeated or even be a one-loss team, and again, this is all assuming that all 10 of these games are played and there's not mass cancellations or the entire season being canceled. That's, I think, the baseline these guys have to start at when they're thinking about this. But if you can get a team that gets through it, like LSU did last year and can go to the playoff, I mean, that's historic, I think, just given what this season is and not having a couple schools, non-conference schools, you can kind of chalk up as W's. I mean, this is a tough year, tough schedule. Especially if let's say if you're LSU or you're Alabama and you have a player, you have your quarterback, you have one of your star players test positive a couple days before the game, and you're still able to go in and win some of these games and beat a conference opponent, then that's an accomplishment I think these coaches are probably hanging their hats on.
Yeah, no doubt. And so earlier today, the SEC did release its own set of COVID-19 requirements, kind of going off what the NCAA had released last month. So take us through some of the notables. I know there was a 12-page document that was released that you outlined in your post on AL.com. So for those of you who are interested in seeing that, head over to AL.com and check that out. But what are some of the notable things that you kind of point out and the conditions that you think are interesting or at least kind of stand out to you in terms of that document?
Yeah, so there was 5 general conditions that they gave on what might cancel football games. I think the wording they used was game discontinuation considerations, which is a little bit vague. I think the question is, do you have to meet more than one of those, and just to what extent do those have to be met? There wasn't exact data points that I don't think that were really given there. But it's a lot about what's happening around the sport and around the game, and not just on a specific team. For instance, you can see it right there, campus-wide, local community positivity test rates considered unsafe. So that's something that's a little bit out of their control and something they have to monitor. If, let's say you're Alabama playing at Missouri, whatever date that game ends up being, and there's a lot of high positivity rates in the Columbia area, will that game happen? Or do you have to meet multiple criteria here for a game to be canceled? I think that's something that we're going to have to see over time. But that's one of the main points. And, testing as well is something that I think a lot of people have paid attention to. Players will have to be tested Sunday as well as Wednesday. And then they're trying to get a third test that will come back in time for a Saturday game. And if you do test positive, then it's a 10-day quarantine, 10-day isolation period. But even if you're around somebody who tests positive, if more than 15 minutes within 6 feet, then you have to quarantine for 14 days. And obviously that can cascade through a team and be potentially damaging to a season. So those are the main points, but also, wearing masks too. I think we see that around us every day living, but you're going to see it on a football field where during timeouts, players will have to pull up a gaiter from their neck. Obviously everybody on the sideline will wear masks, and the officials as well.
Well, those are all certainly great points, and it's worth noting that Auburn's Dr. Mike Goodlett, the chief medical officer and team physician, in Alabama's Dr. Jimmy Robinson are the head team physician there and medical director, are both members of the task force that have met weekly since April devising this plan. So all good stuff. Mike Rodak, we appreciate the insight. We'll be looking for that schedule to come out next week. I know everyone's getting anxious. We're inching our way just a little bit closer to football season.
Can't wait.